in modern counterinsurgency operations. Removing a single bridge can increase control over movement in a rural area by up to 70% within the first 48 hours. That blunt, physical act, the taking away of a crossing, has a life story shaped by necessity, fear, logistics, and the long shadow of unintended consequences. It begins with a problem of movement, not movement of armies alone, but of everything: people, goods, information, villages connected by one narrow span, often built decades earlier for carts or light vehicles, become critical nodes once conflict arrives. Lesser known fact: design compromise. Many rural bridges constructed in the mid-20th century were rated for loads under 10 tons, yet routinely carried vehicles exceeding 20 tons during emergencies, creating structural vulnerabilities that militaries later exploit or remove. The parents of this act are doctrine and geography working together. Counterinsurgency doctrine emphasizes control of terrain, and terrain often narrows into crossings, bridges, ferries, fords. Political pressure adds urgency, demanding visible control without large-scale destruction. Lesser known fact: command doctrine shift. Post-1960s military manuals increasingly prioritize denial of mobility over direct engagement, with infrastructure control listed as a primary method in at least 60% of field guidelines. Early decisions are rarely dramatic. Engineers surveyed the bridge. Intelligence assesses its use. Who crosses, when, how often. Sometimes the choice is not to destroy, but to remove or disable. That distinction matters. Lesser known fact: test result. Field tests show that disabling a bridge without full demolition reduces reconstruction time by up to 50%, allowing faster restoration once operations conclude. Its childhood is marked by hesitation. Removing a bridge isolates not just adversaries, but civilians. Early operations often underestimated the ripple effects. Supply chains falter, medical access declines, local trust erodes. Lesser known fact: supply constraint studies from rural conflict zones indicate that removing a single crossing can reduce food supply flow into a village by 30 to 40% within 1 week. Training adapts quickly. Engineering units learn to dismantle structures with precision, minimizing debris that could be reused as makeshift crossings. They practice controlled removal rather than explosive destruction when possible. Lesser known fact: crew training. Detailed military engineers are trained to calculate load-bearing failure points within minutes, often using simplified field formulas rather than full structural analysis. Early failures are instructive. In some cases, villagers construct temporary crossings within days: wooden planks, ropes, even submerged stepping paths. The intended control weakens. Lesser known fact: battlefield improvisation. Local populations have been documented creating functional footbridges in under 24 hours using materials like bamboo or scrap metal, restoring up to 60% of foot traffic. Small changes begin to matter more than large ones. Instead of removing the entire bridge, forces may block access points, monitor crossings, or restrict vehicle use while allowing pedestrian movement. The act becomes more nuanced. Lesser known fact: countermeasure installing controlled checkpoints at bridge approaches has been shown to maintain 80% of civilian movement while still reducing unauthorized transport significantly. Growth comes as the practice becomes standardized. Manuals include procedures. Units carry specialized equipment, cutting tools, portable barriers, modular components for both removal and reconstruction. The system around the act matures. Lesser known fact: production is Shurapid deployment kits for bridge removal and repair faced early manufacturing delays due to the need for lightweight yet high-strength materials, often limiting availability in the field. Logistics expand. Alongside it, Removing a bridge is not a single action, but part of a network. Alternate routes must be monitored. Supply lines adjusted, communication maintained. The absence of the bridge creates new patterns that must be tracked. Lesser known fact: weather terrain impact during rainy seasons. The loss of a bridge can increase travel distance by up to 300% due to impassable terrain, amplifying isolation. Effects documentation becomes detailed, maps are updated, units log the status of crossings daily. The bridge, even in absence, remains a reference point. Lesser known fact: design compromised temporary military bridges, such as modular steel spans, often sacrifice long-term durability for rapid assembly, with expected lifespans of only a few years under heavy use. At its peak, the act is precise and calculated. A bridge is removed at a moment when control of movement is critical, perhaps before an operation or in response to intelligence of imminent activity. The timing is as important as the action itself. Lesser known fact: test result simulations show that removing a key crossing 1, 2 to 4 hours before an operation can reduce opposing force mobility by up to 50%, significantly affecting outcomes. A defining scenario often involves a village with a single exit route. The bridge is taken down overnight. By morning, movement has stopped. Vehicles cannot pass. Foot traffic is monitored. The area becomes contained, not by walls, but by absence. Lesser known fact: command doctrine, shift. Modern doctrine emphasizes shaping the environment before engagement, with infrastructure denial listed as a primary shaping tool. Why does it work? Because movement is dependency. Remove the path, and behavior changes immediately. People wait, reroute, or stop entirely. The bridge, though small, controls a larger system. Lesser known fact: medical psychological effect. Restricted mobility increases stress levels in isolated populations, with measurable rises in cortisol levels observed within days, but the cost is immediate and visible. Isolation affects everyone. Farmers cannot transport goods, patients cannot reach clinics, children miss school. The bridge, once taken for granted, becomes its absence. Lesser known fact: supply constraint. Healthcare access in rural areas can drop by over 50% when primary transport routes are disrupted. According to field studies, fatigue sets in for those enforcing the control. Monitoring crossings requires constant presence. Guards rotate, engineers remain on standby. The system demands attention long after the initial action. Lesser known fact: crew training. Detail units assigned to infrastructure control often operate on extended shifts, with fatigue management protocols introduced after error rates increased by nearly 20% in early operations. Fear operates differently here. It is not always fear of attack, but fear of being cut off of, losing connection to the outside world. The psychological weight grows over time. Lesser known fact: medical, psychological effect. Prolonged isolation can lead to increased rates of anxiety and depression, particularly in populations dependent on external supply lines. Old age arrives as tactics change. New technologies reduce reliance on fixed crossings. Air transport, drones, and improved road networks provide alternatives. The removal of a single bridge no longer guarantees control. Lesser known fact: countermeasured the use of unmanned aerial supply systems has reduced dependence on ground routes in some regions by up to 25%. Weakening the impact of infrastructure denial. Adaptation continues. Instead of removing bridges, forces may monitor them electronically, using sensors and surveillance. Control shifts from physical to informational. Lesser known fact: production issuerly sensor systems faced reliability problems in harsh environments, with failure rates exceeding 30% in extreme weather conditions. The doctrine evolves. It becomes less about destruction and more about selective restriction. Bridges are no longer simply removed, they are managed, controlled, integrated into broader systems. Lesser known fact: command doctrines, chiffres, and military guidelines emphasize infrastructure preservation alongside control, balancing operational needs with long-term stability. Its legacy is complex. Later strategies borrow from its core idea: control movement to control outcomes. But they apply it with greater precision, seeking to minimize unintended harm. Lesser known fact: battlefield improvisation. Modern units often use temporary barriers or timed closures instead of permanent removal, maintaining flexibility while achieving similar effects. What remains is the understanding that a single structure can define an entire system. The bridge was never just a crossing. It was a connection, a dependency, a point of control. Lesser known fact: weather terrain impact in regions with limited natural crossings. A single bridge can serve populations of several thousand, making its removal disproportionately impact the fuel. In the end, its life is measured not by the moment it was taken down, but by everything that changed afterward. Movement slowed, patterns shifted, lives adjusted, and a quiet lesson: remain control does not always require force. Sometimes it only requires the absence of a path. The moment the bridge disappeared, the village didn't erupt in chaos, it froze. Paths that were once routine became impossible. People paused mid-journey, carts half-loaded, animals tethered. It was as if the heartbeat of the village had stilled, waiting for someone or something to decide what came next. Lesser known fact: terrain impact villages dependent on a single bridge often saw pedestrian travel times increase by 200 to 400% immediately after removal, significantly affecting daily routines. The first days were awkward but telling. Farmers tried to reroute livestock along riverbanks, some attempting shallow crossings that were unsafe. Children walked farther to reach schools on the other side of the river, often in thin shoes, slippery mud beneath their feet. Lesser known fact: medical psychological effect, exposure to unexpected physical strain in such conditions led to increased sprains and minor injuries in up to 18% of the affected population. Early improvisation emerged quickly. Makeshift rafts, logs lashed together, ropes stretched across currents, each attempt a small rebellion against absence, a testament to human adaptability. Lesser known fact: battlefield improvisation. Historical accounts show that civilians in conflict zones can reconstruct temporary crossings within 24 to 48 hours, though often at risk and limited capacity. For the forces that removed the bridge, the pattern of observation began. Soldiers and engineers documented attempts, noting which routes were used, which designs held, and which failed. Lessons were logged for operational planning. Lesser known fact: crew training, detail monitoring, improvisation became part of counterinsurgency. Training, teaching units to anticipate civilian adjustments after infrastructure denial. Weeks passed. The village adapted. Markets shifted closer to the accessible side. Social interactions decreased across the river. Isolation took root in subtle ways. Delayed medical visits, reduced social contact, lower trade volume. Lesser known fact: supply constraints. Economic activity in isolated sections of villages dropped by up to 35% in the first month post-removal. According to historical rural studies, communication became critical. Without physical passage, villagers relied on messengers or intermittent radio signals. Delays caused miscoordination, occasionally leading to shortages or misunderstandings. Lesser known fact: psychological effect in certain communication channels in isolated communities were correlated with elevated stress levels, measured through increased heart rate and reported anxiety. The act of removing the bridge, initially simple, became layered in consequence. It demanded attention from multiple systems: military logistics, local supply chains, civilian routines, A single point of infrastructure reverberated across the human network. Lesser known fact. Command doctrine, shift. Modern military manuals now emphasize the cascading effects of infrastructure denial on civilian populations, urging careful planning and monitoring. As the village adapted, forces experimented with subtle adjustments. Some bridges were left partially intact, gated or barricaded. Others were monitored remotely. Each variation tested the balance between control and disruption. Lesser known fact. Countermeasure remote monitoring of crossings using sensors can maintain situational awareness with less direct manpower, reducing both risk and fatigue. Peak effectiveness, from the military perspective, occurred when access, control aligned with operational goals. In one documented scenario, intelligence suggested insurgent movement along the village's sole river crossing. The bridge was removed under cover of night. By dawn, all attempts to cross were channeled through predictable routes under surveillance. Lesser known fact. Test result: controlling a single choke point can reduce unauthorized movement by over 60%, often more than dispersing forces across wider areas. From the civilian perspective, the peak was tension, quiet but pervasive. Parents worried about children, elders about food. Everyone recalculated daily routines. Lesser known fact. Medical, psychological, effective and short-term mobility restrictions can trigger measurable cortisol increases in adults, influencing decision-making and mood. The cost, therefore, was human as much as strategic. Sleep cycles were disrupted by worry. Extra miles walked added fatigue. Injuries mounted. The absence of a bridge demanded constant awareness, adaptation, and sometimes risk-taking. Lesser known fact. Fatigue: walking additional distances daily for necessities increased reported exhaustion in minor musculoskeletal complaints in roughly 20% of affected villagers. Over time, some began to resist psychologically. Children learned new routes. Adults improvised crossings with confidence. Social networks adjusted. The initial control exerted by the bridge's removal weakened as adaptation took root. Lesser known fact. Resilience studies in rural populations show that by the fourth week of isolation, most adults develop workarounds, restoring up to 70% of prior mobility. Old age of the doctrine arrived as technology intervened. Drones delivered supplies. Portable bridges could be deployed within hours. Alternative transportation modes reduced reliance on a single crossing. Lesser known fact. Production issue. Orly modular bridge kits faced shortages in high demand. Zonies delaying replacement efforts by several days. Despite planning, command doctrine shifted accordingly. Rather than full removal, planners began focusing on controlled denial, parcel closure. Monitored access, timed restrictions. The lesson had evolved. Absence alone was not enough. Precise control, combined with intelligence, was superior. Lesser known fact. Design compromised modern modular bridges are intentionally lightweight to allow rapid deployment but cannot support the heaviest vehicles. Balancing control with practicality, the legacy of the bridge's removal extends beyond the village. It demonstrates how a single point of infrastructure can shape behavior, strategy, and adaptation. Militaries learned the limits of physical denial. Planners learned the limits of human tolerance. Civilians learned the limits of improvisation. Lesser known fact. Historical reviews of rural conflicts indicate that controlled access, rather than complete removal, reduces unintended harm while maintaining strategic effectiveness by nearly 40%. Finally, the story of the bridge closes with reflection. It was never just wood and steel. It was a pivot of dependency, a node in human and military networks, a point of decision. Its absence taught lessons that persisted long after its removal. Sometimes control is exercised not by presence, but by absence. Sometimes power is revealed in what is withheld rather than what is imposed. Lesser known fact. Psychological studies confirm that perceived obstacles of N. temporarican have long-term effects on planning and risk assessment, shaping behavior long after the original event. The life of that bridge, from construction to removal, from a simple crossing to a tool of strategy, is a quiet testament to the impact of infrastructure on human life. In its shadow, people adapt, endure, and remember, and the line between control and hardship becomes unmistakably clear. By the time the dust settled, the village had learned to measure its days not by the sun, but by the presence or absence of the bridge. Life became a series of calculations. Which routes were safe, which crossings improvised, which moments demanded caution. The absence of a structure revealed the network at once connected and the human systems that depended on it. Lesser known fact. Terrain impact villages, isolated by a single missing crossing, often see water collection and war collection and sanitation routines altered, affecting daily life and health outcomes for months. The initial shock faded, replaced by constant awareness. Every movement required planning, every journey carried risk, markets shifted location, social patterns reconfigured. The river, once a line in the landscape, became a barrier and a measuring stick. Lesser known fact. Medical psychological effect extended. Reliance on improvised crossings increased. Accident rates in children and the elderly by an estimated 12 to 15% in comparable historical cases. Adaptation took many forms. Wooden planks, rope bridges, makeshift rafts, all temporary, fragile, yet functional. Civilians invented solutions that were never in manuals, teaching each other methods that combined ingenuity with survival. Lesser known fact. Battlefield. Improvisation, documented, civilian-made, temporary bridges have supported dozens of people at once. Though often with structural instability limiting repeated use, for the forces responsible, observation and documentation continued. Every crossing attempted, every workaround noted, fed back into tactical analysis. The life of the bridge extended into the mental maps of soldiers, into operational doctrine, lesser known fact, crew training, detail engineers, and infantry units are trained to predict civilian adaptation to blocked infrastructure, a skill now formally included in counterinsurgency programs. The peak of its effect was quiet yet total. Movement slowed, options narrowed, and behavior became predictable. It was control achieved without active confrontation, a demonstration of power by absence. Lesser known fact. Test results simulations show that infrastructure denial reduces unauthorized movement more effectively than a small patrol in approximately 65% of cases in rural terrain. But the human cost remained. Isolation stressed the population. Extra miles walked, missed supplies, delayed medical attention, and constant awareness of risk created fatigue and anxiety. The bridge's absence became a weight borne daily. Lesser known fact. Medical, psychological. Effect sustained disruption of routine travel increases cortisol levels in adults, affecting mood, judgment, and sleep patterns. Old age arrived when technology and alternative solutions mitigated the original control. Modular bridges, drones, and improved vehicles allowed bypasses. The removal of a single crossing no longer dictated the rhythm of life or operations. Lesser known fact. Countermeasure modern, temporary bridge kits allow rapid deployment in under 3 hours, reducing the strategic leverage of infrastructure denial. Doctrine evolved accordingly. Rather than relying solely on removal, planners favored selective restriction, monitoring, and temporary barriers. Precision replaced blunt force. Control without unnecessary hardship became the standard. Lesser known fact. Command doctrine shift current. Manuals emphasize infrastructure preservation alongside control. Balancing operational goals with civilian welfare, the legacy of that bridge remains profound. It taught the interplay between physical structures and human behavior, the cascading consequences of absence, and the adaptability of communities under pressure. Militaries and planners internalize lessons in strategy, logistics, and the ethics of control. Lesser known fact: historical reviews indicate that maintaining partial access while monitoring crossings reduces unintended harm by approximately 40%. Compared to complete removal, ultimately, the story of the bridge is a lesson in subtle power. Its life was never measured in materials alone, but in the ripple effects it created, the choices it forced, and the resilience it provoked. The absence revealed what presence once enabled, and in the quiet aftermath, the moral is unmistakable. Sometimes the most profound control lies not in what is built, but in what is taken away. Lesser known fact: psychological studies confirm that temporary obstacles can leave lasting behavioral imprints, shaping community planning and risk assessment long after the original structure is gone. The bridge, removed by strategy, remembered. By consequence, became moored in wood and steel, became a measure of human adaptation, a marker of dependency, and a quiet testament to the unseen forces that shape lives. In its shadow, people moved differently, thought differently, and survived differently. And that is the enduring life story of a crossing that, once gone, revealed everything it had quietly connected.